In other news, not that we needed additional confirmation, but it doesn't hurt. The English modernist Arthur Roche, who in the Vatican II Church is known as the Cardinal Prefect of the Dicastery for Divine Worship, just stated rather candidly that the reason for the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass is theological, doctrinal in nature. On March 19th, Roche appeared on a BBC radio broadcast and said this.
You know, the theology of the Church has changed. Whereas before the priest represented, at a distance, all the people. They were channeled, as it were, through this person who alone was celebrating the Mass. It is not only the priest who celebrates the liturgy, but also those who are baptized with him.
You know, it's unfortunate, but what Roche mentioned is probably more of a minor difference between the pre- and the post-Vatican II theology on the Mass. Much more important and new is what the false cardinal didn't mention, and that is the idea of the Mass as a meal, and the idea of the priest as a mere presider over that meal. Neither of these two new ideas pose a problem for Protestants, and that makes ecumenism so much easier, doesn't it? They went from holy sacrifice to Eucharistic celebration, if that isn't progress. When in 1969 the false Pope Paul VI issued the first edition of the guidelines for the proper celebration of the revised Roman Missal, commonly known as the New Mass, he wrote the following. Listen closely. Quote, "The Lord's Supper, or Mass, is the sacred meeting or congregation of the people of God assembled, the priest presiding, to celebrate the memorial of the Lord. For this reason, Christ's promise applies eminently to such a local gathering of Holy Church, where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I in their midst." Unquote. Wow. Martin Luther could not have said it better himself. It just doesn't get any more Protestant than that. Now, it is true that that was subsequently revised because of a big outcry, but that's not the point. The point is that it was published like that in the first edition, and that tells you all you need to know. So that was the first edition of the so-called General Instruction of the Roman Missal, paragraph 7. You can look it up yourself. The link is in the show notes. Now, in Roman Catholicism, by contrast, the Holy Mass isn't an assembly of the people of God with a presider. It is the true sacrifice of Calvary, offered in an unbloody manner and perpetuated through time. This requires an ordained priest acting in the person of Christ, who is both priest and victim. The faithful join in that sacrifice by uniting themselves to the priest spiritually. And that, interestingly enough, is precisely what is denied and detested by Protestants. They may agree that the Mass is a sacrifice, or their Eucharist is a sacrifice, but they say it can only be a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, not a propitiatory sacrifice, meaning a sin-atoning sacrifice. And wouldn't you know it, the notion of the Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice has been completely erased in the new Mass. And when I say completely, I mean like 99%, okay? It's gone. It's no accident that in the Vatican II Church, a lot of the conservatives think that if they believe in the real presence and transubstantiation, that's all that matters. That's what the Mass is ultimately about, Christ being truly present and giving himself in Holy Communion. But although that is a part of it, the essence of the Mass is the sin-atoning sacrifice. It is not simply Christ being present. In session 22, the Council of Trent taught this, quote, If anyone says that in the Mass a true and real sacrifice is not offered to God, or that the act of offering is nothing else than Christ being given to us to eat, let him be anathema," unquote. That's Canon 1 of Session 22, and you can find that in Denzinger 948. Likewise, Canon 3, quote, "If anyone says that the sacrifice of the Mass is only one of praise and thanksgiving, or that it is a mere commemoration of the sacrifice consummated on the cross, but not one of propitiation, or that it is of profit to him alone who receives, or that it ought not to be offered for the living and the dead, for sins, punishments, satisfactions, and other necessities, let him be anathema," unquote. That's Denzinger 950. Now, is it not evident that what Trent condemns here is precisely what is believed in the new church regarding the new Mass? Back in 1969, Cardinal Alfredo Otaviani published a critique of the new Mass known as the Otaviani Intervention. In an accompanying letter to Paul VI, His Eminence wrote, quote, "The Novus Ordo represents, both as a whole and in its details, a striking departure from the Catholic theology of the Mass as it was formulated in Session 22 of the Council of Trent," unquote. Now, Cardinal Otaviani wasn't just anyone. He had been working in the Holy Office, the chief doctrinal authority in the Vatican, since at least the days of Pope Pius XII, and eventually became the head of the Holy Office under Antipope Paul VI. By 1969, Otaviani had retired, but what he had to say regarding doctrine obviously still had tremendous weight. So, when he said that the new Mass departs from the Council of Trent, that was huge. And consider what that's saying. The Council of Trent's teaching on the Holy Mass is infallible dogma. So a rite of Mass that departs from that is necessarily heretical. The Novus Ordo Mass is Protestant. It is a Protestant liturgy. That's why they don't have a real offertory anymore. See, offertory suggests sacrifice. What do they have instead? A preparation of the gifts. Preparing gifts, that goes well with a meal service, right? Gotta set the table. And that is exactly why the altar is very often only a table now. See, altar implies sacrifice. Table implies meal. And so there is no communion rail separating the priest from the people, because if it's a meal, well, you want everyone around the table. So there is no more holy place set apart for sacrifice, separate from what is profane. The sanctuary has become a worship space. And of course, communion in the hand fits all that perfectly. Who eats a meal by opening his mouth and waiting for someone else to feed him? No, you go and pick up your food and then you eat it. And you can find that confirmed also when you look at the architecture and the art that have accompanied that false new theology about the Mass. Many Novus Ordo churches look like alien spaceships, and the inside is usually designed in a circle or a half circle, because that expresses the community that is gathering around the table, whereas the traditional theology is that of the priest standing at the altar like the captain of a ship, with the passengers behind him, facing God, and making intercession on behalf of the people through that sacrifice which speaks more eloquently than that of Abel. The true Catholic Mass, in every way, bespeaks transcendence, mystery, sacrifice. The new Mass, on the other hand, bespeaks community, fellowship, meal. So yeah, Arthur Roche is entirely right when he says that the theology that underlies the new Mass is quite different from the theology of the traditional Catholic Mass. That's true. The new Mass does not fit the Catholic religion, just as the traditional Mass does not fit their new conciliar religion. And now you know why they must get rid of that traditional Mass if their conciliar religion is to survive.